New York State recorded 731 new COVID-19 deaths on Tuesday, and that marks the biggest one-day jump since the infections first started.
More than 12,500 people have died in the U.S. So that's about 40% of them in New York State, the epicenter of the U.S. outbreak. As deaths continue to rise across the country, data from some states are showing that the African-American population is bearing the brunt of the virus.
Well, African Americans made up nearly 70% of the deaths in the city of Chicago, although they make up just 30% of the population. And Mr. Trump, along with the nation's top infectious disease expert, Dr. Anthony Fauci, noted that African Americans are more vulnerable due to their higher likelihood of underlying illnesses.
Diseases like diabetes, hypertension, obesity, and asthma are disproportionately afflicting the minority populations, particularly the African Americans. Unfortunately, when you look at the predisposing conditions that lead to a bad outcome with coronavirus, the things that get people into ICUs, that require intubation and often lead to death, they are just those very comorbidities that are unfortunately disproportionately prevalent in the African American population. So we're very concerned about that. It's very sad. It's nothing we can do about it right now except to try and give them the best possible care to avoid those complications.
Well, the Trump administration is meanwhile facing tough questions over how it had handled the early stages of the country's outbreak. Now, the latest reports that Mr. Trump's economic advisor, Peter Navarro, had warned the U.S. leader back in January that the coronavirus could potentially kill hundreds and thousands of Americans.
And Mr. Trump said in a daily task force briefing that he hasn't yet read the memos. Our U.S. Bureau Chief Simon Marks has more.
He said that everything was contained and senior advisors surrounding him were giving interviews insisting to reporters that there was no threat that coronavirus was going to come to the United States. Indeed, the president himself was saying that even though there had been a couple of cases in the United States, he was absolutely sure that they were going to be able to reduce those numbers very quickly to zero. We now know that Peter Navarro, his former trade advisor on China, now the man in charge of overseeing the Defense Production Act. That's the bit of law that allows President Trump to instruct factories to produce some of the supplies hospitals needed. He wrote a memo for the president and for the senior staff at the White House at the end of January in which he warned, and I quote, that Americans would be defenseless in the case of a full-blown coronavirus outbreak on U.S. soil. The details of that memo published earlier today by the New York Times. President Trump was asked about it during the White House briefing a short while ago. He said that he didn't read the memo. He said he hadn't even read it yet. He planned to go and read it after the White House briefing ended. He conceded, I didn't look for it either. But President Trump remained throughout tonight's briefing in a very, very defensive crouch about the actions that he took to cut the country's travel inward from China, and then also the travel ban from Europe, insisting that those measures alone would be proved ultimately to have saved hundreds of thousands of lives here.